Only God accepts worship.
Jesus receiving worship, evidence of his divinity. One of the clearest evidences of Jesus' divinity in the Bible is the fact that he consistently receives worship. Worship, according to Scripture, is reserved for God alone. In the Old Testament, worship of any being or object apart from Yahweh was condemned as idolatry, Exodus 20:3-5. Yet in the New Testament, Jesus accepts worship from his followers without rebuke, affirming his divine identity. Biblical evidence of Jesus receiving worship. The worship of the wise men. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Matthew 2:10-11. From his infancy, Jesus was worshipped by the Magi, who recognized him as the King of Kings. Such homage was reserved for royalty or divinity, emphasizing his unique identity. The disciples worshipped Jesus after calming the storm. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Matthew 14:33. After Jesus calms the storm, his disciples bow down and worship him, acknowledging his divine power over nature. Jesus does not correct them, affirming that their worship is appropriate. The healing of the blind man. He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. John 9:38. After being healed, the blind man worships Jesus. Unlike angels or prophets who refuse worship, Revelation 22:8-9, Acts chapter 10:25-26, Jesus accepts it, indicating his divine status. Thomas's declaration. Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." John 20:28. Thomas worships Jesus as both Lord and God after witnessing his resurrection. Jesus does not rebuke Thomas, but instead commends his belief, affirming the truth of his declaration. The worship of Jesus at his ascension. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. Luke 24:52. After Jesus ascends to heaven, his disciples worship him. This act of worship underscores their recognition of his divine authority and eternal existence. Angels worship Jesus. Let all God's angels worship him. Hebrews chapter 1:6, quoting Deuteronomy 32:43. Even the heavenly beings worship Jesus, a privilege reserved for God alone. Theological implications. The consistent worship of Jesus throughout the New Testament affirms his divinity. In Jewish theology, worship is reserved for Yahweh alone. Deuteronomy 6:13 commands, "Fear the Lord your God, serve him only." Jesus' acceptance of worship would be blasphemous if he were not God. However, his identity as God incarnate makes this worship appropriate and necessary. Furthermore, both humans and angels worship Jesus, and the New Testament never portrays Jesus refusing worship. This stands in stark contrast to the responses of other righteous figures, like Peter and the angel in Revelation, who explicitly redirect worship to God alone. Acts chapter 10:25-26, Revelation 22:8-9. Jesus' acceptance of worship aligns with his divine nature. Challenges for skeptics and non-believers. Why did Jesus accept worship? If Jesus is not God, why did he accept worship without rebuking those who offered it, unlike angels and prophets who directed worship to God? What does "my Lord and my God" mean? In John 20:28, Thomas explicitly calls Jesus "my Lord and my God." If Jesus is not divine, why does he affirm Thomas's declaration instead of correcting him? Why do angels worship Jesus? Hebrews 1:6 commands angels to worship Jesus. How can this be justified if he is not equal to God? Why is Jesus worshipped at his ascension? In Luke 24:52, the disciples worship Jesus after his ascension. How can skeptics reconcile this act of worship with Jewish monotheism if Jesus is not divine? Why do the Magi worship Jesus as a child? In Matthew chapter 2, 10-11, the Magi worship the child Jesus. Why would such worship be appropriate if Jesus is not God? Why does Jesus accept worship after his miracles? In Matthew 14:33 and John 9:38, individuals worship Jesus after witnessing his power. How can this be explained apart from his divinity? How can Jesus be worshipped in heaven? In Revelation 5:12-14, Jesus is worshipped alongside God the Father by every creature in heaven and on earth. How can this worship be justified if Jesus is not divine? Why is worship of Jesus consistent across the New Testament? If Jesus is not God, why do multiple New Testament authors depict him as the recipient of worship, a practice reserved for God alone? Why did the apostles promote worship of Jesus? The apostles, who adhered to strict Jewish monotheism, worshipped Jesus and encouraged others to do so. Were they mistaken, or did they witness evidence of his divinity? What other figure accepts worship without rebuke? In Scripture, no human or angelic figure accepts worship without immediately redirecting it to God. How can Jesus' acceptance of worship be explained without acknowledging his divinity?